I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our UK bat species this evening. There's quite a lot to tell you about, and I'm trying to give you a bit of an overview rather than going into any one thing in too much detail. So as Anthea said, I work for the Canal River Trust. I'm an ecologist, which means that I look after the wildlife and habitats along the canal, the Canal and Avon being one of my canals, but I also look after the Bridgewater and Taunton Canal and the Swansea Canal. And I've been with the Canal and River Trust for nearly 10 years. So before that, as I mentioned briefly, I was working for the highways. And so when I was working for the highways, it was quite similar. I had to think about the grasslands along the verge, trees and the woodlands. And then when I started working for the Canal and River Trust, suddenly there was this wet bit in the middle that I had to get to grips with too, and a whole host of different species from before, like water voles and otters. So this first picture I've got on the screen, this lovely little bat over here. Oh, can I put on a pointer or remote control? No, a pointer I'm looking for. No, never mind. I think you can see my cursor, my mouse cursor. So this bat over here, this is a lesser horseshoe bat. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a minute, but they're one of my favourite species because they look to me to be very fluffy as a species. Oh, and I should also just mention, so I'm here representing the Canal River Trust today, but I'm also a member of the Wiltshire Bat Group. So this talk has kind of got a nod to both. I will talk about the bats and canals, but I am also talking about bats in Wiltshire a bit more generally. So there we go. So as I said, there's quite a lot for me to go through tonight. I'm going to try not to talk too quickly and not to go into too much detail about any one thing. But I do want to give you a bit of an all-round idea about bats because they're a really fascinating species and they've really suffered a lot of persecution over the years. So I think that education is the best tool to help protect these lovely little flying mammals. And I've also got lots of pictures throughout my talk to try and break it up so it's not too text heavy. This is my #1 favourite UK bat. This is called a Barbastelle bat, and they are our only truly black bats. All of our other species are brown, but these guys do have silvery tips to their fur, which you can sort of see in this picture. And I think it gives them a bit of a look of the older gent, which makes them quite endearing. And I must say a big thank you to my very good friend Daniel Hargreaves, who is an incredible photographer of bats, and he's very kindly lent me quite a few of his pictures. So I must say thank you to Daniel. You might have heard there's been a lot of myths in the news about bats and COVID-19. And so I thought I'd just quickly take this opportunity to try and set the record straight a little bit. The COVID is a zoonotic disease. Now, zoonosis means that it's something that humans can catch, but that it's come from animals. And with COVID, we think that it has come from bats a long way back in history, but what's happened is that it's jumped through a different species. The research is looking like it's pangolins rather than bats that the virus jumped from. And in all the research that the scientists have been doing so far, they haven't found the virus that causes COVID-19 in any of the 1,400 plus species of bat around the world. But because COVID-19 is a coronavirus, which basically means it's just like a common cold, there are lots of coronaviruses present in the bat population, just like there are in our population, and many other species of mammals too. And the reason why COVID has and other zoonotic diseases can make it from the animals to the human population is we have this defined spillover point. So it's where humans are coming into too close contact with wildlife, whether that's from intensive agriculture where forests are being cut down and cattle are being grazing in more and more wild and remote areas, or from people going out there and trying to catch these animals to eat. So there's the two different spillover things. And there's lots and lots and lots of rubbish in particularly social media. So if somebody's really interested in this topic, and you've heard a fact that you think you'd like to find out a bit more about, please don't just take it as it's been said. And I highly recommend the Bat Conservation Trust. They're our umbrella organisation in the UK who protect bats, and they've got a really good frequently asked questions segment within their website. There's loads of information there if it's a topic that you're particularly interested in. So putting that aside, I just felt that needed covering. Oh, and the other thing to just say about COVID and bats is that in the UK, we are much more likely to give COVID to bats rather than us catch it from bats. It hasn't been found in the bat species in our country. And however, if we were to give it to them, it could devastate their populations, and they're already on the brink. So we really need to make sure, if you do have bats in your loft, if you can avoid going up there, or if you do need to go up there, if you can protect them by wearing a face mask whilst you're up in the loft, for example. And bat activity from bat groups, which I'll talk a bit more about at the end, has almost entirely ceased for the last 2 years because this risk of us passing it over to them is so high. So here's some fun facts for you, trying to set the record straight on some myths as well along the way. Bats are the only true flying mammals. We also have some mammals who can glide quite well. There's a squirrel in particular, but bats are the only mammal capable of true flight where they flap their wings. Bats are nocturnal in this country, so they come out at night to forage for insects. Around the world, you do have bats that are around and about during the day, but in the UK, that's the exception rather than the norm. Bats aren't blind. The way that the scientists discovered this was pretty horrific. They took some bats into captivity and they wanted to understand how they were navigating in the dark. And they blinded the bats and then found that the bats were still able to fly around without any problems. And it was at that point that they realised they must be doing something different, and they discovered echolocation, which is this method of shouting really loud and really high pitched and listening to all the echoes bounce off their surroundings, which again I'll talk about a little bit more later. Bats are mammals, and they give birth to live young, which they then feed on milk that the mother bats have gone out and foraged for insects to make. And they normally only have one baby at a time. And also bats don't reach sexual maturity until they're about 3 or 4 years old. They're quite a long-lived mammal. Our smallest species, the pipistrelles, live for about 10 years, and then our bigger bats can live for 20 to 30 years. So it can take a population a very long time to recover when they're only having one baby a year, and they don't start having their babies until they're 3. And that's part of the reason why bats are so highly protected and why they've really suffered so much from various persecution. All of the bats in our country are insectivorous. They'll feed on pretty much anything that's out and about flying around at night. Pipistrelles love those tiny little midges, the ones that come and bite you when you're enjoying that lovely glass of wine on a summer's evening. But our bigger bats will eat really big beetles, up to things the size of cockchafers or maybugs, the quite big beetles that have the really big fancy eyelash-like antennae. So they'll eat lots of different insects and obviously moths too. So we've got 18 different species of bat in the UK, and they all occupy different habitats and different niches, and they'll eat different insects depending on where they live and what they come across. And bats will roost in a wide variety of places, including trees, caves, mines, houses. They're quite adaptable. Here's another, sorry, my dog's just decided that she wants a cuddle. Let me just push her off. So here's another picture of a bat. This is one of our rarest species in the UK, as was our barbastelle actually, our truly black bat that I showed you a picture of a moment ago. This guy is called a Beckstein's. Now, both the barbastelle and the Beckstein's are super rare. We think that we're looking at about 1,500 individuals of the Beckstein's and maybe 3,000 individuals of barbastelle, although those numbers are a little bit out of date. But in Wiltshire, we have both species, and barbastelles we have an awful lot of because we've got lots of really lovely woodlands that are nice and dark and have trees with cracks and crevices that are perfect for these bats to live in. So we're really fortunate in our county. So bats make up about a quarter of mammals worldwide, and they're 1/3 of mammals in the UK. You quite often hear people saying that bats will fly in your hair. That's not true. What we think happens, because they can get quite close, their echolocation calls are so specific that they can see items that are just the size of the width of one human hair. And so if you're out in the evening and there are moths or flies buzzing about, the bats can see those flies. They can see that they're flying around you as a human. But quite a lot of these, particularly the bitey flies, are attracted to come over to give us a nibble, and the bats will see those insects and will try and catch them. But what might sometimes happen is they could misjudge it, and then they might bump into us, but that doesn't happen very often, and they certainly won't get stuck in your hair. Our bats in this country don't drink blood. The bats that do drink blood, and there are some, are called vampire bats. There's 3 different species. They all live in South America, and they're not actually as scary as people might think. So they do drink blood, but they mostly drink the blood of farm animals, and they make a tiny little puncture with their really sharp teeth. And they have an anticoagulant in their saliva that's actually being studied to see if it could be used in stroke victims to help with their blood flow. So it's, you know, this bat is really helping us discover some stuff that could be really life-saving. And then they just lap up the blood that's running free, and they don't have very much. They drink it just like a dog or a cat is lapping up at water. They are a little bit greedy, and they drink a bit more than they really need, and they end up being quite rotund and quite heavy, so much so that sometimes they can't take off again. So what they have to do is they run around in the farmyard weeing until they've lost enough weight and flapping their wings that they are able to take off again. So these scary bats that people talk about, I don't think they're that scary at all. Bat wing membrane is the fastest healing mammalian tissue, which is a real advantage because they rely so entirely on being able to fly to get their food. And particularly in this country, bats' biggest predator are actually cats. And cats can do an awful lot of damage to bat wings, both through puncturing it with their teeth, but also tearing it with their claws. Cat attacks are the #1 cause for bats coming into to care. In the Wiltshire Bat Group, we have a care group, people who look after bats who've been injured and then try and release them into the wild again. Pipistrelles, which are our smallest bat in this country, can eat up to 3,000 midges in one night, which is a quarter of their body weight. And a whole colony of pipistrelles, which can be normally about 100 individuals, could eat a ton of midges in just one night. The echolocation that I've mentioned before, radar was an exact copy of it. And so it just shows that evolution has created something that we also find really useful, that we've, you know, discovered ourselves. And the bat's heart rate is really massively variable. So when they're flying around, it can hit 1,000 beats per minute. But when they're hibernating over the winter, when they shut their bodies right off and try and save their fat over the winter, ready for the spring, their heart rate will drop to just 10 to 20 beats per minute. So they properly switch off. And then to mirror that in the summer, when the female bats have gathered together to have their babies, it can get really hot in the roost and their body temperature can go up to 65 degrees C. Whereas in the winter, when they've switched their body off and they're shutting their organs down, or not shutting them down completely, but switching them off for a bit, they can drop their body heat to just 2 to 5 degrees. So they're capable of withstanding these massive temperature fluctuations. They're such fascinating mammals. So the word Chiroptera is the group that bats fall under. It comes from chia being hand and pteron as wing. Their wings are literally made from their hands, and I've got a really good photo to demonstrate that in just a minute. And as I was saying earlier, bats are the only mammals in the world that are capable of true powered flight. The way that the bats fly is quite different to how birds fly. Birds sort of flap their wings up and down, whereas bats will move their wings in more like a figure of 8. And the skin cells, the skin structure that goes across their fingers to make their wing is just 2 skin cells thick. And when I was saying earlier about the cat attacks, that's really good that it's so thin, because it means that it's really fast to heal. The fancy word for wing structure, the wing skin, is the patagium. The patagium is the fastest healing mammalian tissue. So here's the picture that I was just saying I had. So this is a brown long-eared bat, and this was in Savernake Forest. So you can see here that we've got the humerus, so the sort of the top part of your arm, and then the ulna and the radius, this long part of your arm. And then sticking up here is the bat's thumb, which is really short compared to the rest of its fingers. Its first and second fingers run quite close together right at the top, and then these other fingers drop down and have the wing membrane stretched across them. And you can see these are the veins inside the bat's wing. So it's a really delicate, very soft structure. So I'm sure you've heard that all bats in the UK are fully protected by law. It means that it's illegal to disturb bats, both when they're in a roost and when they're flying. It's illegal to kill, injure, or to capture a bat. It's illegal to damage, destroy, or prevent access to a roost. And it's illegal to transport, sell, or offer to sale our bats. And that's because they've been really badly persecuted over the years. I was just trying to remember which species this is. This is one of our very tricky to tell apart little brown jobbies. I think this one's an Alcathoe, remembering that I stuck in a cryptic one just to test myself. So why have our bat populations suffered so much? There have been massive declines in their populations, particularly over the last 100, 150 years. In the last 100 years, our horseshoes have dropped by more than 99%, which is just horrific. And all bat species in the UK have dropped by more than 70% in the last 30 years. In 1994, we lost the last of our mouse-eared bats, and that was the first mammal to be declared extinct in the UK since the wolf, which was more than 300 years ago. It's in part because of habitat loss. We've lost more than 50% of our ancient woodlands since the war, and more than 97% of hay meadows since the war. We've also lost more than 200,000 kilometres of our hedgerows. Now we are starting to see that turn around. We are planting new hedgerows, particularly along the canals, the Canal River Trust, and I'm sure that you've heard about rewilding projects, but we've got a lot of lost ground to make up for these bats to be able to rebuild their populations, especially given that, as I mentioned earlier, the populations are really slow to recover. They are sadly still very much under threat by us too, particularly persecution, and especially with what I'm sure we've all heard about COVID recently. Bat crime is on the increase again. The climate crisis is a major problem for the bats because as the temperatures change, the insect populations don't seem to be able to fulfill their life cycle in the same way that they did before. Many insect species, this is quite recent research, but many insect species aren't able to fully complete their life cycle in the time that they used to do it. So they end up sort of stuck at the like the grub stage, which means that they don't make it into the flying adult insect stage. And then by missing that stage out, there's no bugs flying around for the bats to come and eat. So I think that's going to be a real emerging threat. There's been a major issue with agricultural intensification. So we lost a lot of hedgerows as agriculture grew to make bigger and bigger fields, as machinery got bigger, to make it more efficient, to make it more profitable. Also, antibiotics and wormers have been a big problem because of the impact that has on the insect populations that would live in the animal dung. For example, our greater horseshoes, I mentioned earlier, they really like the cockchafers, the big maybugs. They also really like dung beetles, but with a drop in organic cattle and more use of wormers, the dung beetles can't feed on the cow dung, which means that the populations have massively dropped. And lighting is a really big problem for bats too, not just because the lights themselves mean that bats feel more vulnerable to predators and so are less likely to come into the lit up areas, but also what we see happen is that where you have very dark areas of woodland that are close to very bright urban areas, the insects that normally would feed in the woodland are drawn out of the woodland and over to the lights. But the bats who live in the woodland, who are generally the more vulnerable, the rarer species, like the two I showed you right at the beginning, the barbastelle and the Bechsteins, they're less confident to come away from the woodland and into the lit up areas to follow their food, which means there's less food available for them in the woods. So light is one of my major bugbears. I think that we should switch them off, switch them down, put shields on them. Really recent research, I attended the National Bat Conference just a couple of weeks ago. They were saying that even lighting that's only on for a few hours at night, so that lighting that might come on around dusk for a couple of hours and then is off for the majority of the night and then it comes back on in the morning, even that is having a really substantial impact on our bat populations. I don't think they've fully worked out just why yet, but it's just all lighting is really bad basically. And it's a particular problem where we have protected sites nearby. Now, I've done a really sketchy map to show you. So you lot are here-ish, Limpley Stoke and Winsley area. Now, what this map is showing you is it's all of the special sites of scientific interest, triple SIs, and special areas of conservation sort of nearby. And the reason why I wanted to show you this really badly drawn map is because where you are in Limpley Stoke and Winsley, you're right in the middle of the Bath and Bradford-on-Avon bats special area of conservation. Now what that means, I hope you can see my cursor, these black underlined areas are all specifically designated for the bat interest. So they're mines like the Combe Down and Barthampton Down mines and the Winsley mines, and they're also woodlands such as the Midford Valley Woods and Cleve Woods. So these are all protected sites nationally and internationally because the bats live there and feed there. And you're right in the middle of this really important area. And then I've just drawn in the blue to show that the canal goes right through these protected sites and links some of them up as well. And I'm very resistant to any lighting along the canal corridor, because I believe that it should be a dark zone for wildlife to be able to safely cross the landscape. And in fact, we've recently had a bat that was first caught at box mines. We've got box mines on here, yeah, box mine. Dorbenton's bat, which is particularly known to favour foraging over water. They've got really big back feet, and they will use their feet to catch insects as they're emerging from the water. So this bat had migrated all the way from box mine to, I've forgotten the name of the place now, but more than 60 kilometres away. Normally in the book it says that bats tend to travel 20 to 30 kilometres, but this bat has gone 60 kilometres, which is a real record. Can't think where it turned up, somewhere in Berkshire, near Newbury. That's where it was, near Newbury. And I mean, I can't say for sure, but what connects Box-ish and Newbury? Canal and Avon Canal. So I think that this bat on its record-breaking journey probably followed the canal for at least some of its route, which is brilliant. It shows how important dark corridors are. So I'm going to do a really whistle-stop tour of our 17 species of bats. I've got a video to show you first, which I hope is going to work. I was explaining to Anthea earlier, I've been having some major IT problems recently. My laptop completely stopped connecting to the internet, and they delivered a new one to me today, which seems to be working. Here we go. Let's make that full screen. See, I'm getting all of the pop-ups because this is the first time I've a heterodyne bat detector, 110 kilohertz. You get this beautiful alien-like song. It's the bat shouting. You can see as their heads are moving, they're moving their ears around like satellite dishes, listening to all of the bounces of the echolocation calls as they're shouting. Now,
sorry, Laura, just to say, I don't think we could see what you were showing us because we've got two maps.
Oh, that's frustrating.
A still picture, and the noise was rather confusing, but of course I now understand it was. You might, can you redo that?
I can indeed. Let's try that again. So we need to, where's my cursor? Thanks, Anthea. Sorry that wasn't working. Let's try again. We want this one. And share sound. Yes. Let's try again. Can you see? Yeah. Sorry, it's not happening today, is it?
We can see that now, the bat box.
There you go. See how fast their ears are moving, they're listening to all of the bouncing echolocation. So you can see from these two maps the bat's distribution is very much restricted to the southwest of the UK. We've got 2 species of these horseshoe bats. They both make that warbling sound on a heterodyne bat detector. Lesser horseshoes are smaller. Lesser horseshoes, we say, are like hanging plums. So they're about the same as my thumb hanging from the ceiling, from the, like you saw in that clip, hanging from the roost. Whereas the greater horseshoes are more like hanging pears. So they're more like the whole of my hand with my thumb. And our numbers are around 13,000 for greater horseshoes and 50,000 for lesser horseshoes. The lesser horseshoes are more common, but the greater horseshoes are bullies. And so if they discover a really nice roost site that already has lesser horseshoes roosting in it, the greater horseshoes will bully, for want of a better word, the lesser horseshoes out of the roost. And here's one hanging up in its roost. This was actually along the Canal and Avon Canal near Avon Cliff, roosting in the rock formations there. And the other really interesting thing about the 2 horseshoe bat species is they're the only species in the UK that do this stereotypical sort of wings wrap around their body, a bit like you would imagine a vampire would do. So when we see them hanging up from the ceiling, we know what we've got without getting too close and having to poke them around to work out which species they are. We have brown and grey long-eared bats. The brown long-eared bat is really common and widespread. Numbers are about 200,000. You can see they've got these really fantastic big ears. Sometimes when they're hanging up in their roost, they'll tuck these fantastic features behind their wings, and all you'll see is this inner part of the ear, which is called the tragus. It's the little fleshy knobby bit in the middle of your ear, and it helps direct sound into your ear. So they can quite easily be misidentified if somebody can only see their tragus. They're also one of my favourite bats. And also just to mention that this guy's got a little silver ring, sorry, it's a female because she's wrong on the left hand side. This is an ID bracelet, essentially. Doesn't cause them any trouble. It's very, very lightweight, and it's got an individual number on it, which is how we knew that that Dorbenton's bat I mentioned about before had flown such a long distance, because we'd put a ring on it. The grey long-eareds are really restricted in their range. Sorry, I didn't explain the other map. All right, I've got another video. Let's see if this one's going to work properly this time. So these are barbastels, the one that I started out with a picture right at the beginning, our only truly black bat. And this is them emerging from a tree. That first one was a bit quick. Let's see if we can start the video again. So this is a crack in a tree, and they're popping out, heading out for the evening to go and find some food. If you listen really carefully, you can hear their wing beats in some of these. They come fluttering past the camera. We've got no idea how the bats decide what order to fly out in, whether it's the most confident and bolshy bat that comes out first, or whether it's the one that's really scared and is getting pushed out by the rest. But eventually they all end up popping out. So you can see this is the black bat I mentioned before with the silvery tips. And again, they're quite restricted to the south of England, but here we are in Wiltshire, we've got completely green round us, and we're learning more and more about barbastels all the time. There's currently a project a PhD student's carrying out to try and figure out a better method of working out whether barbastels are living in a woodland or not, using bat detectors spread throughout the woodland and seeing how many times the bat detectors pick up this species of bat, to then determine how likely it is that there's a whole group, a colony, living there rather than just perhaps one or two individuals. I will mention the Wiltshire Bat Group again at the end, but if you feel like this kind of research might be something that you'd be interested in getting involved with, please do check out the Wiltshire Bat Group. We're always looking for more volunteers to help us with studies and things. And then so we also have our noctule and our lyslers. These are our bigger bats. I've got a sound clip of a noctule, the sound that a noctule makes on a bat detector, if this is going to work. Ooh. Oh. Did you hear that, Anthea? Did you hear that one?
Yes, very briefly.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll play it again. So again, this is the sound that we hear on a heterodyne bat detector. So it's not the actual sound that the bat is making, it's the sound that the bat detector has created to make it into our audible range. What we say with a noctule bat is that it's saying chip chop, and then you hear the sound getting closer and closer together towards the end of this sound clip, and that's what we call a feeding buzz, which is when a bat has potentially spotted some food, and so it increases the rate of shouting to build up a really clear picture of the insect. I'll play it again a couple of times. So chip chop, chip chop, chip chop, chip chop. So noctule and lyslers are two of our bigger bats. They really like living in trees. We very rarely come across bat roosts of these species in anything other than trees, and they're quite a big bat, so they do need quite a big cavity to live in. They're also quite noisy and quite smelly, and I know a few people who have discovered noctule roosts because they've been walking through a woodland around dusk time in the summer, particularly on a really hot day, and before the bats come out to feed at night, they start chattering to each other, so you can hear this coming from inside a tree and smell the quite strong musty odor of bats, and lo and behold, noctule roost. Trying not to spend too much time on any one particular species, but there's a lot to get through. This guy, Serotine, is another big bat, quite similar to the noctule. They make a very similar noise, but this time it's less regular. So instead of being chip chop, we say it's more like a jazz drummer, like chippity chop, chip chop. Play it again. Very jazz drummer-esque. And again with that feeding buzz at the end. These guys really like living in houses, particularly if you've got a large loft space with a gable end. They like to tuck themselves right at the end between the wall and the wooden beams. That's their favourite place. One of the biggest Serotine bat roosts in the UK is just over the border in, is it Dorset or Berkshire? It's on the border with Wiltshire because we used to monitor it. Berkshire, I think. And then we've got our pipistrelles. Now, pipistrelles are the most common species in the UK. We used to think that there was just one species called the pipistrelle. And then in 1996, when we started doing DNA testing, we realised that there was definitely more than one species. There'd been some rumours that there might have been before that because they looked a bit different sometimes. And also they make different sounds on the bat detector. So the common pipistrelle will shout echolocate at 45 kilohertz, whereas the soprano echolocates at 55 kilohertz. So people had a bit of a feeling that there may have been different species, but it wasn't until the genetic DNA testing came in that we were able to say for sure. And then after that, we also realised that there were Nethusius pipistrelles around. And these guys you may have seen in the news, they're the ones that have turned up occasionally as far away as Poland and Russia. They've had their ID bands put on sometimes at Chew Valley Lake in Somerset, and there was some over on the Kent coast as well. And then they turned up sometimes just months later over in Eastern Europe, and they're the biggest, furthest known bat journeys that have been taken. We have the Nethusius pipistrelle. Well, we have all of them on the canal, but we've found the Nethusius pipistrelle on the canal. We've heard them echolocating in devises, but we haven't found any roosts yet. So we've got a quick clip of a common pipistrelle on a bat detector. Now this sound, we say, is like a wet slapping sound. Where's the link? Oh, here. A wet slapping sound. And if I was with you all in person and we were out on a bat walk with our bat detectors, I would encourage you to hold on to your cheek and flap it so that you could hear in your head the sound of a common pipistrelle on a bat detector, a very wet slappy sound. I'll demonstrate. It's up to you doing it in your own homes to do it so you can hear it too, but you do this. Actually, that might have been loud enough that the laptop picked it up. Normally when I'm outside, no one's got a hope. Wet, slappy, knocky sound. Whereas the soprano pipistrelle is very similar, but on the bat detector, you would be listening to a higher frequency. You'd be tuned into a different radio station. That's how we talk about it. Wet slaps and pops. And so those are the shouts that the bat is sending out there and listening to the echoes so that they can see their world. Fascinating little animals. Common pipistrelles and soprano pipistrelles are so small that you could fit them inside of a matchbox, and they only weigh about the same as a 2p coin. So they're really tiny little bats. And of all of our bat species, common pipistrelles are the ones that we think are most comfortable with living in urban environments. They are known to be quite adaptable when it comes to roosting sites. So they will roost in houses, and they have been seen foraging, looking for food around street lights. We think that might have given us a false confidence in terms of impacts of lighting on bats because the pipistrelle is so comfortable with it. And yeah, it's an area that we're still learning about, but common pipistrelles are quite happy living in villages and towns. And here's a close-up picture of one, again with the ID ring on. Now we get into our myotis bats, our little brown jobbies. These are all quite tricky to tell apart. They all look very similar, brown and fluffy. These guys, Natteras and Daubenton's, both really like foraging over water. Daubenton's, this bottom picture, this is the one that I said had the really big hairy feet and that we found has travelled more than 60 kilometres. He's also got quite leathery looking ears, whereas the Natteras has this sort of very foxy looking face. Both really like living in trees. Daubenton's really like living close to water, so they quite like living in bridges as well as trees that are over water. Here's our rare one again, the Becksteins. Look at the tiny restricted range on this one. I've actually updated my figures in here, so we've got a prediction of about 20,000 individuals of the Becksteins now, but they're still pretty rare. I mean, that's not very many, individuals of a species. Some other little brown jobbies. The Alcathoe we only really discovered only discovered living in this country a few years ago, and we've still not found any roosts, but we know that they are here. I think the next picture I've got is of an Alcathoe. They're very generic looking, a brown fluffy thing with a little black face. We have had to identify these guys using droppings to confirm their DNA. And we might have an interesting species called a Geoffroy's, which is quite common over on mainland Europe. But so far in this country, we've only had 2 records of the bat. Both were caught by licensed bat surveyors during research work, one of whom, which one is it? This one, I think. Yeah, one of whom was discovered at Brown's Folly, so not too far from where you are, and by my husband. It's another myotis, so it's another little brown jobby, but you can see this one's got quite a yellowish look to it, which was what made my husband realise there was something different about this bat. And then again, we used dropping DNA to establish that it was this Jeffroy's bat. So bats are primarily woodland species. They live in trees, and this lovely little diagram from the Bat Conservation Trust just shows you the kinds of places in a tree that bats would want to live. It's colour coded by species as well, which is quite useful, but far too much information for what we're talking about today. The take-home message is any gaps, cracks, crevices are ideal for bats. Sometimes they might even get behind really dense ivy, but it tends to have to be quite mature, thick ivy. So we try to ask people to leave ivy when it's growing on trees, not just because of the potential it can have for roosting bats, but also because ivy is one of the last resources of pollen for insects in the autumn, and it's one of the first things to come into flower in spring. So it's really important for our invertebrates. And you may have heard people say that ivy kills trees, that it strangles them, but actually that's not what the research shows. If a tree is already in decline and is dying, then ivy would be a contributing factor. But the ivy in and of itself doesn't kill the tree, and it doesn't strangle it. There's a lot of myths out there about bats and trees. Hopefully I've set the record straight on a couple of things today. Oh, I've got some more videos to show you. I really like this one. I hope it works. So my husband has been carrying out a research project in a woodland close to where we live. He's trying to see if it's possible to create more roosts for bats by kind of causing superficial damage to trees to start roosts forming. And as part of that, they have, sorry, let's just switch that on. They've put cameras up on trees. Oh, sorry, that's not let me finish talking. To see where the roosting bats are living, and to see if we can use cameras to monitor these new roosts. And sometimes quite interesting footage turns up on these cameras. Oh, now it's going to pause. Here you go. So before I press play, because this is a super quick video, I'll play it a couple of times, but we're looking at a tree, and this is a woodpecker hole in the center of the screen in the tree. And I think there's something coming in from this top right hand corner of the screen. Is that where it comes from? A bat. You go crawling in. Oh, but there's somebody already home. I'll play that again. Can you imagine you've discovered what you think is going to be your home for the day, and you go to crawl inside? They may well have been here before. Bats will quite often come back and use the same roost, so they've got quite a few different roosts that they might use depending on conditions. But on this occasion, nope. He's even pecking at him, look. Does not want to share his his hidey hole with a bat. And I've got another video. Oh, we've got a Beckstein's roost, so one of these rare species emerging out of a bat roost. Out of an ash tree in the middle of summer. Roost is right up here at the top of the tree. Oh, this is on an endoscope, so I'll tell you about an endoscope in a minute. But so we've just poked inside the hole, and you can see the little faces of the bats here, all snuggled up together. This will be females with their tiny babies tucked away up against their tummies. So this is an endoscope. very similar to, you may have come across in medical necessities. And then we've got a digital screen, just like on a digital camera. We can poke the cable up into tree roosts and then see whether there are bats in there, just like on that video. And here's a still shot of the same species, some Becksteins. Yeah. And then I mentioned earlier about how some of our bat species will even live in houses. Bats don't make nests, they don't bring twigs in, they don't chew on wires, they don't scratch holes in walls or anything like that. They're just looking for a safe crevice or crack to tuck themselves into, so that they're safe from predators and that the temperature is going to stay relatively stable. They can get into quite small gaps, so something that's only about a centimetre square entrance, some of our smaller species like the pipistrelles can squeeze in if it opens up into a larger cavity behind. And so this illustration from Bat Conservation International just shows the kinds of places that bats could tuck themselves away, particularly under roof tiles is a favourite, and up and under the soffits and the vents, which can give them access into the main roof as well. And is there one on here for, no, under lead flashing, where that's lifted around chimneys, can be a good spot too. And sometimes in old World War II pillboxes, we have a few of these along the canal that we're looking to improve for bats. This one was not quite on the canal, but it is, trying to think of the name of the place, near Horton. And it's got like little windows around the sides where the army would have been watching for the enemy. The pillboxes are quite often along the canal because the canal was one of the final lines of defence had the German troops ever got here. But they're perfect for bats. Inside, they're just an empty shell, and we can improve them by either putting bat boxes up inside for the bats to go into, or even as simple as having a piece of wood against the wall that's sort of levered away slightly, just to create that lovely crevice that they like to tuck themselves away into. This is an ongoing project for us. We've got loads of pillboxes along the canal, so much potential to create bat roosts. So I'm just going to quickly swizz through the bat year to give you an idea of how bats' requirements vary so much through the year and how their roosting requirements can change. So in the spring, bats will have come out of hibernation. They'll be really hungry. Their weight will be quite low from where they've relied on their fat reserves to get them through the winter. And they'll be starting to think about having their babies. So they need to get out, get fed up, get eating. And they generally come out of hibernation in sort of March time. But as I mentioned earlier, with the climate crisis, seasons are all over the shop. I heard today somebody was picking raspberries at the weekend off of their raspberry plants. So it's all over the shop at the moment. But in general, bats will come out of hibernation when their food, the insects, start to emerge again from their winter dormancy. And then they're starting to feed up over April and May. Females are getting nice and fat, looking for places that are going to be warm and safe and secure to have their babies, which they do over the summer. So the females will gather together in what we call maternity roosts. So all of the same species, they'll go to a place that they've normally been to before. They'll get really hot, as I said at the beginning, up to 65 degrees, all huddled together, really warm. They'll have their one baby, which when the baby is born, they weigh about a third of the female bat's weight, which would be kind of like me giving birth to a 3-year-old. So that's quite a feat. And when this baby's first born, they're so vulnerable. They have their eyes shut and they're deaf. They don't have any fur, just like tiny puppies and kittens. And they rely entirely on their mum. So they cling on to her for the first few days after they've been born. So she's given birth to this hefty lump. And then she's still got to have it hung on to her while she goes out feeding because it's too tiny to be left at home on its own. And then after a few days, the babies all get left behind in the evening whilst all the mummy bats go out and forage. Sometimes 1 or 2 females might be left behind, maybe ones who haven't had a baby that year, and they're there to sort of look after the nursery of babies. And when the mums come back to the roost, they can find their individual baby out of a colony that could have 100, 200, maybe even 1,000 bats, and they'll be able to sniff out their baby from that mass. And then as the baby gets bigger, baby bats go from being these tiny, furless, vulnerable little things to almost indistinguishable from adult bats in just 7 weeks. And so then they'll be flying independently, and their mum will actually teach them how to forage. They've put tiny little LED lights onto mums and babies, and they've watched the lights following each other around as the mum's teaching the baby how to use their echolocation, how to find food. And that's fantastic. I love bats. Did I mention I love bats? So then as we get into the autumn, this is when it's breeding time for the bats. So I've just mentioned that they give birth in the summer and that they will have been pregnant in the spring, but they actually mate in the autumn, and the female bat's body will store the sperm and the egg separate over winter while she goes through hibernation. And then only when weather and conditions and food availability is right will the fertilization take place, so that the baby has the best conditions, best chances of survival. And the way that the bats mate in the autumn is because the very sensible female bats are heading out to try and find their winter hibernation sites. Around your area, they're going to be coming to the mine system, to the Bath and Bradford-on-Avon bat sack, to Winsley mines, to box mines, and they'll be flying around, making sure that that particular crack or crevice that they hibernated in last year is still there, checking out the general temperature inside the mine. Do they need to go deeper in the mine? Do they need to be somewhere completely different? And whilst the females are doing all this busy, making sure they've got somewhere safe to hibernate, the males take advantage of this, and they'll come and fly around the entrances to the mine system, waiting for the females to arrive or to come out of the mines. And that's when they'll mate with them. Very sneaky males. Sometimes the males will even mate with the females over hibernation. So the females are completely torpor. They've shut their bodies down. Their heart rate has dropped right down. And the males, if they find one, and if the male is awake enough, he will sometimes mate with her over the winter. We have a hibernation site at Marlborough Tunnel near the secondary school in Marlborough. There's a housing development that's just been built there. I'm trying to think of a better way to describe it, but we've got a nationally significant old railway tunnel there, and we get hundreds of bats hibernating in there, 300 to 500 regularly over the winter. And we'll go in there a couple of times to count the bats and to see which species are present to carry out this research. And a few times we've been in there and we've heard the bats mating. We've heard a female making quite a lot of squeaky noises, having been rudely awoken by a randy bat. So then over the winter, as I've mentioned a few times, the bats are going to switch their bodies right off, because there's not the insect availability for them to come out and feed. However, bats will still sometimes come out of hibernation. So it could be that they've been disturbed and they need to find a new roosting site, or it could be that it got colder than they were expecting, or it was warmer than they were expecting, and so they needed to move to a different location. Or they might have just got really thirsty or really hungry and been desperate to get out and see if they could find some food, because they didn't manage to stock up their reserves enough over the summer and autumn. Bats are at their most vulnerable in the winter, as you can imagine, because they've shut their bodies right off, but also in the summer when we've got these big gatherings of female bats and their babies. And so when I mentioned about the legal protection, this is why their roosts are so heavily protected, because if you were to inadvertently disturb a whole colony of bats, say the ones in the Marlborough Tunnel, 300 to 500 bats were disturbed in the winter, and they didn't manage to find somewhere else that was suitable for them to go back into hibernation, or they couldn't find enough food, and you wipe out all of those bats with just a simple move of, you know, perhaps people have broken into one of the caves and made a lot of noise, which does sadly happen. We've had raves take place in the mine system, normally in the summer, which is less of an issue, but the bats are really vulnerable to disturbance, but particularly at those times of the year. So a little bit about echolocation, just to give you some visual on that, because I've kind of described it, but there's nothing like a couple of pictures. So they make these really, really loud ultrasonic squeaks, which they produce but when they flap their wings. They crush their lungs to expel the air at a high enough rate that it gets the frequency and the volume really, really loud. And they also temporarily deafen themselves by disconnecting the bones in their ear, because the shout that they make is so loud that if they didn't disconnect their ears, they would permanently deafen themselves. So you can see in these illustrations, here's our bat over on the left hand side. He's sending out a block of sound, an echolocation call, and then up ahead of him there's a moth fluttering around, and there's a tree a bit further away. And so as this block of sound heads out into the environment, it hits the moth, and the moth sound bounces back to the bat, and then the rest of the sound wave carries on towards the tree, and then the sound wave of the tree will bounce back to the bat, and then the echo of everything else will carry on as well. So echolocation is an incredible way of navigating in the dark, seeing without eyes. And I mentioned earlier that bats occupy different habitats and they have different niches. To some extent, you can tell what bat you might have flying around when you're out on a dusky evening in the summer by the bat's behaviour. Bats that like to quite frequently go round and round trees, these are our pipistrelles. As I mentioned, we've got the Daubenton's with the big hairy feet who can travel up to 60 kilometres along the canal system. They really like the water. We've got this bat out in the open, which could be a ceratine or our pipistrelles. This one up here, he's flying really high and fast. This is our biggest bat, the noctule bat. The noctule bat's echolocation call is as loud as a jet engine taking off, more than 70 decibels. So they've got these really loud echolocation calls because they fly generally so high and in such open spaces. Their echoes have a lot further to travel to be able to build up the picture that the bat needs of its surroundings. And I think this is my last, I think there's one more slide after this one, so that just a little bit about the Wiltshire Bat Group. We are a voluntary collection of individuals who really care about bats. Some members of the group carry out research projects, and some of those are funded, some of them are not, they're just for interest. We've got bat box schemes in a few woodlands. There's bat boxes at Biss Lane near Trowbridge and Green Lane Wood, Savanack in the forest, and trying to think of some others. Ordinarily we would carry out bat box checks at least once or twice in the year, normally in the spring and the autumn. We try and avoid disturbing the bats over the summer so that we can learn more about which species are present and how their colonies, their populations are doing. But as this slide indicates, in 2020 and 2021, we haven't been able to do these hands-on activities because of the risk of us passing COVID to the bats. And this lovely arty picture is inside Savanack Tunnel that I mentioned earlier. And here's what I was saying about a piece of wood that's been fixed to the wall and then levered away for the bats to just sneak in behind. I should just say this was very much posed. There weren't any bats in either of these features. when this photo was posed for. And here's a bat box. So this is made out of a material called woodcrete, which gives it strength and durability, whilst not being as heavy as something like concrete. So it's a mix of concrete and wood shavings. And we put these up in trees at 3 to 4 meters high. We put them up at different aspects, because depending on what the bat requires at different times of the year, it might need to move around different roosts, different temperatures. But you can see this one's got pipistrelles in it. You can easily get 60 bats in one of these bat boxes. So they are really good for bats. Not as good as trees though, which are the absolute #1 best place for bats to be. And if you've enjoyed my talk this evening and you're enthused to learn a bit more about bats, I really recommend these books and guides. This one down here is my absolute favourite. That's how I first got into bats. It's a really easy to read from the British Natural History series. Phil Richardson, I think, has 2 books called Bats. Both are very good, but the British Natural History one is the best. Got lovely little cartoon illustrations in it. And then these other 2 are a little bit more technical in terms of trying to identify particular species of bat, either in the hand or from watching it fly around or from having a bat detector and listening to the sounds on the bat detector. This one here is a really handy fold out leaflet. It only costs about £3 or £5. And it gives you a really good overview of all the bats in this country, with beautiful photos, identification features on one side, and then on the other side a little bit of basic information about the kinds of habitats you might find these species in. And I think, yeah, that's me done. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Laura. It was your enthusiasm, your knowledge and your clear love of bats was really, really astounding.
Yeah, thank you, Anthea. I really do love them.
So much for that. We've actually gone past an hour, so I don't know how much time you have, but shall we just have a quick look to see if anyone has a question? And I'll just leave it to you, Laura, to decide.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to stay as long as people have questions. And, you know, if anybody's had enough and they want to leave, please don't feel that you're offending me. If you want to go and do something else, it's not a problem.
Thank you so much. I think I'll just suggest people put their hands up. Or there's a little, can you see the little yellow at your end, Laura?
Yeah, I've got the chats and I can see hands up. So if you want to put anything in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up, or if you want to unmute, whatever people would like, or if no one's got any questions, that's fine. Oh, Tony's got a question. Of course you have. Go on, Tony.
Laura, you told me a long time ago about how to identify when you pick up when you've got bats regarding their poo and what you have to do. I just wonder whether you want to explain to people that.
Yeah, I can tell people about bat poo. So bat poo, generally speaking, looks quite similar to mouse poo, which I hope you can all have an image in your minds of what mouse poo looks like. But if you are suspecting that it's bats rather than mice, if you pick up a piece of the poo and you squish it between your fingers, if it turns into dust, then it's bat poo, because they are solely eating insects. The poo will just turn into dust, whereas mouse, please always wash your hands if you ever do this, but mouse poo would either be slimy because it's so fresh, or it will be hard when it's got old, but bat poo will turn to dust. And it's very good for your runner beans, bat poo, apparently.
Thanks,
Mandy and Steve, you guys have got your hand up.
Hi. Yeah, that was fascinating. Thanks, Laura. 2 quick questions, if I may. Well, one was, you said that bats were about 1/3 of the mammals in the UK. Is that individuals? So the number of individual mammals?
No, in terms of numbers of species. So we've got 18 bats and about 60 species of mammal altogether.
All right, it's still amazing, isn't it? I hadn't realised that, I have to say. The other thing is you spoke about lighting quite a lot, which I totally agree with. You didn't mention colour of light. Is there anything to say about what colours of light are better or worse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's an area that is very much current in terms of research, ongoing research. The thinking is that red lights are less disturbing to bats, whereas white and blue are the most disturbing. And they did some experiments to see, well, if red lights are less disturbing to bats, but people can still see things in red light, could we perhaps change our street lights to red light? But what they found was that the visibility is so much worse even for humans with red light that it wouldn't be safe to switch our lights to red. And I believe that there's a current study going on right now in Worcester with a pinky kind of hue. A friend, one of my colleagues lives in Worcester, and she noticed that the lights were pink the other day. She asked me if I knew anything about it, and I said I didn't. I said, why don't you go and Google it? And yeah, she found out that there's this study going on that Worcester City Council are carrying out to see if pink lights might be the answer.
Oh, that'd be interesting. That'd be good to know the results of that, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah, well, keep an eye out on their website. I'm sure that they'll update it.
Yeah, thanks.
No worries. Anybody else?
There was a question in the chat about, are cats the only predators? Which sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Anna. They are not the only predators, no. Bats have evolved alongside birds of prey and owls. Birds of prey are one of the main reasons why bats are nocturnal, to avoid the birds of prey. Sometimes with our really early emerging bats, you can see them being chased by birds of prey that have stayed out late enough to try and catch the bats. But cats are the worst predators in this country, because quite often cats are quite smart, and if they work out where bats are emerging from a roost, they have been known to sit outside the roost and just swipe at the bats. I also heard a story about a cat sat in someone's garden very intently watching their pond, and then all of a sudden the cat leapt into the air, and the person went out to have a look at what had happened, and the cat had been watching a bat flying around the pond and then had just snatched it out of the air. And the thing with cats is they don't need to eat bats. They're not doing it because they're hungry. They're doing it because they're having fun and they want something to play with. And so quite often they won't kill the bat. So cats have really nasty bacteria in their teeth, in their mouths. And if they aren't killing the bat outright, they're passing really nasty infections onto the bats that are really hard for the bat carers to then combat with antibiotics, and to hope that the bat can be re-released. So the best thing you can do if you have a cat is to keep it indoors. If you can't keep it indoors all the time, if you can at least keep it indoors overnight, particularly between dusk and dawn, but around dusk and dawn in particular. And Sarah, I saw you had your hand up. What was your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering how successful it's been to prosecute people who do disturb bat caves, because I know that cavers have been known to go into them and to actually take away bars that are protecting the entrance to caves as well. Yeah,
it's really hit and miss. However, very recently, I think it was last year, a caver in Devon was fined a few £100 for breaking into a cave, taking a photo of a bat and admitting on social media to having stroked the bat. But I mean, that this person had pretty much made his own bed by saying where he was, what he was doing, putting it all over social media. Most of the time people don't make it quite so easy to find them and prosecute them. And even when we have concrete proof of a bat roost being destroyed, like for example, more frequently than I'd like to admit happens, developers will carry out bat surveys. They're told they have bats present and that they have to go through the licensing process. they don't want to, they see that as too expensive, too onerous, whatever, and will just go ahead and either remove all evidence and have another ecologist come in who will then see that there's no evidence of bats and will give them a different answer, or they just plough on regardless. The biggest, we've had the record fine for a developer, I think it was 2 years ago, I think it was £40,000 they were fined and had I don't think they had a jail sentence, but it went on their criminal record for having destroyed a bat roost, and that was in London. If you're interested in a bit more information about those, if you go onto the Bat Conservation Trust website, they've got a section, I think it's called Bats and Crime, and there's quite a few case study examples there. It's just so hit and miss as to whether we can gather the right evidence, and quite often it's too late to both for gathering the evidence that would have been required and the proof that the bats were there before. And it's very difficult with the police because they're not specialists on wildlife crime. So, and the forces generally only have 1 or 2 individuals who might be their wildlife crime officers. And if they don't necessarily come across it that often, because whilst it's their role, it's not what they're doing all day, every day, it's difficult for them to fully know what they're supposed to do. So the Bat Conservation Trust do support wildlife crime officers in those instances, which is great, and that's where they've had those successes, is where the Bat Conservation Trust have been involved too.
Thank you.
That's all right. Patricia, you've got your hand up.
Laura, thank you very much for your talk. I found it extremely interesting because I watched the bats come out of my neighbour's roof in the spring. I know what time they'll come and I know where they're going to go round and round. My question is, you mentioned that females seem to always have one baby. Are there exceptions, and sometimes they have twins?
Yes, exactly that. Very rare though. And I think that it's only really been recorded in the common pipistrelles, but it can happen. But if you think about, if the bat gives birth to 1 baby and that's 1/3 of their body weight, imagine giving birth to 2 and then having to forage and find enough food for 2 when you're such a tiny little mammal. It must be really tough.
So how do bats multiply? If one female's having 1 baby, the status quo, how do they increase in numbers?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's why population recovery is so difficult, but it's because as individuals, they can live for 10 to 30 years, depending on the species.
Yeah.
So whilst they're only having 1 a year, they're living for quite a long time comparatively to other small mammals. Yeah. But absolutely, I mean, that's part of the reason why bats are struggling so much.
Thank you.
No worries. Sally, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting, Laura. Thank you so much. I just want to make a comment, really, because I didn't see on your map a bat roost, which we've got quite close to us on Midford Lane.
We have the Wiltshire Biological Records Centre. They keep all of the data for all bat roosts. The map that I showed was for designated protected sites, so I didn't have individual roost sites on there, but Wisbrook would have it, and if they didn't, they would probably like to know about it. So if you go onto the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Records Centre website, you can submit the record, you can let them know that there's a bat roost there.
I think they know, because we're part of a development is threatening it at the moment. And we have,
okay.
By the way, the cat doesn't go out.
I'm sure they probably know about it, actually, Laura, but it's the Limpley Stoke mine. I wonder, I mean, your map had SSSIs on it, and this is actually a working mine. So, I mean, are the SSSI mines that you had in your map, are they disused mines?
No, I think some of them are working mines. The Box one, I think, is still working. Denise, are you still there? Is this the one that you and I were chatting about? I'm not sure.
I think it will be.
It will be, yeah.
So I can't remember what we said when Denise and I were chatting about it. I think we established that it was known and that the consultants were taking it into account with what they were doing with the development.
That's great.
But yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of that particular one. I'm not really sure what to suggest.
No, don't worry. I think Steve and I both know.
Yeah, sorry, this is Ian. Denise is just taking a phone call. Yeah, I mean, it did. The protection of bats did feature heavily in, you know, and we often mention it when there are planning applications that may encroach on bat roosts. So, you know, we're very conscious of bringing that up wherever possible, really.
Excellent. No, that's great. I think that, you know, as individuals, commenting on planning applications is definitely the best thing that you can do. And the more of you who comment, the stronger, you know, your comments will be, and the more likely that the planning authority will take them into account. But it can be quite difficult because the legislation that protects bats, whilst it's quite strong, if you're talking about a development that's near a bat roost, it can be argued, you know, the consultants can argue that it's not going to be impacted or not significantly impacted. The way that our planning system is set up is really not to protect wildlife, not properly, and so it's quite easy for developers to be able to get around any wildlife constraints that there might be. Even when you've got a protected species on site, you know, an ecological consultant can jump through all the hoops to establish which species it is, how many there are, and then in most cases they can mitigate and create an alternative roost space if it comes to that, to move the bats to. So having a protected species on site sadly isn't necessarily enough to stop the development from happening, which is why I couldn't work in consultancy. It's just soul destroying, in my opinion. Your main role is there to enable the development, whereas at the Canal and River Trust we're a charity, we're a well-being charity, so we're all about getting people to come out, enjoy the canals, come for a walk, see the wildlife, see the greenery, and so my role is very much about protecting those habitats and making sure that the bats have somewhere that they can go where they're going to be able to find you know, substantial food and safe roosting places and be free from disturbance. So yeah.
One thing you mentioned there was mitigation, and you know, we have put, you know, where it's been not possible to stop the development, we've kind of underlined the need for mitigations, things like, you know, minimising the amount of light spill, minimising the number of trees that are being cut down. If trees are being cut down, then replacing them with other trees, that kind of thing. And you know, unfortunately, planners will not come round and police mitigations. They do not come round and police any conditions that have been put in place as part of planning. So it's our jobs as individuals to police these things, and if we feel that conditions are not being met, if we feel mitigations haven't been met by the developer, then we need to report it to planning enforcement, who will come round and will look that that's been done.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I think we all need to be aware of that, you know, we have the right to say, look, this should have happened, it hasn't happened.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ian. And there was a study not too long back by the bat community to try and establish when mitigation has been recommended as part of a development or whatever, how frequently, firstly, is that mitigation put in place? And then secondly, how frequently is it monitored to see if it actually worked? And the figures that came out of that were pretty shocking, really quite bad, that not only is, in many cases, it's not being built, but often when it is being built, nobody's checking to see if it was even the right solution. So yeah, absolutely right. Let the planning authority know if you think that something hasn't been done right. I had to do it here. We live not too far from a corner shop, and they refurbished their signage. You know, it's a spa, so where it says spa, they had that refurbished, and as part of the refurbishment they had lights with it, which would have been fine, except that they used very bright LED lights, and the spa background is white, and so these bright white lights were shining onto the bright white hoarding, and it was brighter than all the street lights around here. And they hadn't got planning permission for it, so we went through a bit of a hoo-ha with the local authority, and they determined that they shouldn't have the lights. They were fine to have the advertisement but not the lights. And then next thing I know, as soon as we get to the winter again and dark nights, they're switching the lights on again. So I got in touch with the planning authority, and they came out and reinforced the message that the lighting shouldn't be used. But you're right, Ian, it comes down to us as individuals to make sure that things are done as best they can be in the right way.
Laura, thank you so much, and what you're doing is absolutely invaluable, and I'm sure we all have learned so much from you. I mean, one of the things, if I might say, that I was fascinated by was the sounds. I'm not asking you to say anything more, but it was really interesting, the range of sounds made by the bats you played at the beginning. Was very, very musical, and at the end it was more like that, you know, that clapping kind of sound. That, to me, that was just extraordinary, as was the whole talk. And I don't know if anybody else has another question, or whether I think we ought to let you go because it's been an hour and a half. Do we all agree that Laura deserves a huge round of applause?
Thank you. Oh, thank you,
Laura.
No worries. Thank you ever so much for having me. And yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So nice to see your enthusiasm. That's what was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for such good questions as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Laura.
Thanks, everyone, then. Bye.
Have a great evening.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
End meeting.